Welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, November 4th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Vice President Kamala Harris and her campaign in the final stretch of this campaign season, steamrolling into Election Day with growing momentum that might be enough to counteract the advantage that the former President Donald Trump had built up over the past 3 weeks leading into this final home stretch where Kamala Harris very clearly over the past 5 to 6 days has built up the upper hand. Now, before this video gets started, I wanted to give a huge shout out to the Discord team for Let's Talk Elections. They launched a brand new website today. It is ltelections.com, all one word. I'll link it in the comment section down below. Highly recommend that you check it out and use it on election night. They have some phenomenal graphics here where they're going to be going through all of the states and the amounts that each candidate is getting. They're also going to go through all the Senate races, all the House races. This truly is such a spectacle to look at. The graphics look amazing. Everything about it looks amazing. So I encourage you to take a look. They have things from state amendments to, of course, the presidential race, to every congressional race, Senate race, every proposition, whatever it might be. They have it here, and you can search for it in a really easy site. You can use this on mobile. You can use this in general. This is something I'm just honestly very pleased to see because it is so phenomenal to see any type of engagement and work put into action for websites like this that can actually help the way that people understand and analyze elections, especially when this day and age, things like paywalls exist and prohibit everyone else from looking at election results. I would also do a huge shout out to the Discord server. It is discord.gg/LTE. You can also go to discord.com/invite/LTE. I apologize for, advertising this too heavily, but I do want to say, definitely recommend checking it out. They have a lot of information on here, a great community, and overall something that I definitely want to say. If you're interested in doing anything or talking about anything online in politics, especially after this election, this is the place to go, but it would be a great place for you to go before the election gets started. Okay, back to Kamala Harris and gaining momentum and looking at where we are just a day before the presidential election. Now, historically, I've done my election predictions the day before the race ends. I think that honestly is something that I've helped myself come to realize that might not be the best thing to do because there are a lot of things you can learn on the day of the election before the election concludes and any votes are counted when you want to predict an election. Another big thing, too, is I am extremely conflicted about my election prediction. This momentum that Kamala Harris has gained has sort of completely changed the way that I've understood this race. 5 days ago, I gave Kamala Harris back the advantage when it came down to the 2024 election. A week before, I gave Donald Trump the upper hand. And honestly, for a while, it looked like Donald Trump was gaining back the support he had lost leading into the election, that over the past 3 weeks, 2 out of the 3 weeks, it looked like Donald Trump was very much going to be the next president of the United States. And I didn't really think much was going to change that. A week ago, Kamala Harris sort of rebounded, got to a point where she was in contention, probably had a 51% chance odds at winning. And although FiveThirtyEight says that Kamala Harris loses the election today, there is some very real and substantive momentum that you can feel and see across a number of different data points that suggest Kamala Harris is in a better position today than she was a week ago, and she was winning the election a week ago. And so this momentum also comes in forms of, what we've been seeing in terms of the closing message of the Donald Trump team, of what Donald Trump did in 16 and 20 versus now, as to how he came to a close and came to this bridge of trying to reach out to swing voters, undecided voters, Republican voters, Democratic voters, overall trying to build out a Big Ten. It's something that he did in 2016 and tried to do in 2020, but doesn't seem to be doing this time around, whereas the Kamala Harris campaign very much seems like they're trying to. And there are a lot of indicators out there that say that Kamala Harris is in a position where she's better off than what other polls might suggest. A good example is that brand new poll we saw from Ann Seltzer, which was a very high quality one that has been largely seen as the gold standard for Iowa and an indicator of what we might be able to see in other Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota, and even some Senate races like the ones in Ohio. And the Des Moines Register poll, again, that has been accurate dating all the way back to the 2008 presidential election, has been really nailing the margins here for the first time ever, saying Kamala Harris takes the lead against Donald Trump. Now, there are a lot of speculation around whether or not this is her time to miss the mark, that Ann Seltzer, for the first time in a long time, is completely outside the margin of error and is just completely missing how her state is going. And for, all what I believe, I think that to be true. I do think Donald Trump is going to win the state of Iowa. But it's a great result for Kamala Harris and does show that, again, in this closing stretch of the campaign, maybe this poll is onto something that a number of other sources are not. But it isn't just the Ann Seltzer poll that is shining some optimism on the Kamala Harris side and what their campaign thinks might be the winning strategy for this election. The New York Times, Siena College released their final sets of polls for the swing states, and what you might find isn't super surprising, but it's good news for Kamala Harris nonetheless. It does show some pretty interesting differences, though, when you're looking at how people are voting in Michigan and Pennsylvania in comparison to some other states. Honestly, for me, what I've come to learn from it is that you can't always predict everything from one universal poll, but you can get some understandings of how individual states are going to go, and they might surprise you. For instance, Nevada, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Georgia are all considered to be Harris states on this poll, but Pennsylvania and Michigan are tied, and Arizona, Trump wins by 4. It's fascinating to think about, but this could be our reality assuming these polls are correct. And if they are, even if Donald Trump wins the tied states of Pennsylvania and Michigan, Kamala Harris wins the election. And when you're taking a look too, the thing about the political betting markets, which is why I don't really touch them, is that they've been very much taken over by the Republican wing, looking at those who are on Twitter, right-wing actors that have been trying to boost a lot of money into this race to say that Donald Trump's going to win this election and that Polymarket is the indicator of whether or not Donald Trump wins that election. And so rather than being what it used to be even 3 months ago, this reputable site that had a lot more people coming into it that weren't looking at it from the lens of, partisanship, but rather they want to make the most money out of it. We've seen an influx of over $2 million into the market since we first started covering Polymarket. So a lot more money has come into it, largely being promoted by Elon Musk and other right-wing people on Twitter who have come to say, this is the market to save. Donald Trump is winning this on election day. He wins the election. So, of course, they're going to spend money into it. But after the Ann Seltzer poll dropped and the New York Times poll dropped and a number of other indicators were saying, especially those gender gap numbers in some of the early vote, you can see that the odds pretty much tanked for Donald Trump from where they were before. They're still in the positive, which is why I will say I believe this election to be a lot closer, and I do think Kamala Harris holds a narrow upper hand as of right now. But when you're looking at it, 56-44 is very different than what it was before, 67-33. That's a very big difference on the overall electoral map. And so to see that really come to fruition, and you can even see it when it comes down to some of the battleground states as to how they're going to win or how Democrats or Republicans are going to win, it is overall just really something that we need to watch closely because it does show that some people are changing their sentiments. Some people are changing their minds. But again, the good signs here aren't just the Ann Seltzer poll. They're not just the political betting markets. They're not just the New York Times and Siena College. It's a whole number of things too. For instance, we talked about this recently. We talked about the gender gap when it came down to early voting. Pennsylvania having the biggest one of it all. It may not be enough for Republicans to be able to overcome it by the time we reach Election Day. A lot of the polls we are seeing too, especially once we've seen now, released today, released yesterday, say that of the people who have voted early, the overwhelming majority of them support Kamala Harris. Well, based on those party registration numbers in states like Nevada, which we've been tracking quite heavily, it would seem to suggest that independents in Nevada are breaking for the Democratic Party in an overwhelming way. That makes it difficult to assess the state of the election in Nevada, but overall is good news for the Kamala Harris campaign. You see it in the polls out of Nevada that say that early voting is favoring Kamala Harris sometimes by 10 points plus. That's phenomenal given that Republicans currently hold the upper hand in raw vote number, but that's because a huge chunk of voters are undecided that don't get evaluated into that two-party comparison, and it seems to be that they are breaking for Kamala Harris. And again, I think all across the board here, we have seen consistency in that if Kamala Harris is to win the election, it will be because of this final week and this final week alone that has really helped her get back into being grounded into where she can be and how she can win. A week ago before my prediction, I still believed that Donald Trump would have won the election. Before Halloween, which was my last prediction, October 31st, I would have said Donald Trump was going to win the election because that's where I honestly thought we were at. I believed that Pennsylvania was shifting away, that we had seen a mass exodus in terms of Latino voters across the board, across the country, and that it wouldn't be enough for Kamala Harris to win the election. But I think now, too, and on that note of data points we are getting today, Univision and YouGov did a brand new poll out of Pennsylvania showing that Kamala Harris has only lost minimal support compared to 2020. I know what you might be thinking, though. Why is it that a loss in minimal support is good news for Kamala Harris? Well, when you take a look at what the data was suggesting nationally from Univision just 3 months ago when Joe Biden was on the ballot, they had Biden up just 14 amongst Latino voters. Biden was up 14% nationwide. Keep in mind, back in 2020, that advantage for Joe Biden was roughly 30 points. So to see it reduced from 30 to 14 was quite substantive. The Republican Party had been playing up this whole thing for the 2024 cycle that Donald Trump was going to win Latino voters. It wasn't even about shifting. It was about winning Latino voters, that he was going to win the majority of them nationwide. He was making gains. And then came in Kamala Harris, who was able to win over Latino voters in a way that we hadn't seen Joe Biden do. And then as we got closer to the election, her numbers started to improve. Went from a 20-point advantage to a 25-point advantage nationwide. And now what we're seeing in the state of Pennsylvania in specific, it's a 34-point advantage. Nationally in 2020, it was 32 points. Now, the reason why I say it's a slight reduction in support from the last cycle is because when you look at Pennsylvania in specific, according to CNN, it was roughly about a 42-point difference. 69 to 27. So you're seeing some support bump up for Donald Trump. He gains 3 points. Kamala Harris loses 5 points relative to Biden. It overall equalizes, though, to a point where it's within the margin of error, and reasonably, given that this is a sample of 400 people, it in theory could be back where it was in 2020 or worse for Kamala Harris. But the idea here for Donald Trump's campaign was that in order to get over those 80,000 votes that separated the candidates, you needed massive, massive gains amongst Latino voters, which for a while, it very much looked like they were getting. Even when it came down to the crosstabs in states like Pennsylvania, we saw that Kamala Harris's candidacy was being propped up by white suburban voters and not necessarily as much by minority voters as they were in 2020 or for Democrats in 12 or 2008. But now this sort of puts a halt in it. And so now we're at a point where you have really good data points saying that Kamala Harris is doing really well amongst women nationwide. She's doing really well specifically amongst white suburban women, which make up a huge chunk of the Pennsylvania electorate, which is the majority white voting electorate. On top of that, too, the idea here was that that was going to counteract the massive losses amongst Latino voters across the country, the massive losses amongst male voters across the country, specifically male voters of color. But now, this Univision poll, which again, doesn't say Kamala Harris is going to steamroll Trump in comparison to 2020, but going to be roughly on par with that, is good news. And they also found, too, that a significant chunk of Latino voters in this state, Pennsylvania in specific, have heard about the floating island of garbage comment from the Madison Square Garden rally. I know the Trump team said this doesn't matter, it's just one rally. They're trying to play this up for something that it isn't. 88% of Pennsylvania Latino voters said that they have heard about it before. And 71% of Puerto Rican voters in the state of Pennsylvania, which comprise of 400,000, nearly 400,000 voters that are of Puerto Rican descent in the state of Pennsylvania, 71% say that even intended as a joke, this comment suggests that there is racism within the Trump campaign. And you can find a number of different focus groups that have been conducted in Pennsylvania in specific, interviews that have been conducted, on the ground information, and now real substantive data that shows that that comment reached a very far and wide within the Latino community and does a lot of damage to Donald Trump's candidacy. And although he is making minimal gains compared to 2020, in order to overcome that 80,000 vote hurdle, if we are seeing white voters shift away from Donald Trump in a way that they had voted for him for 2 years prior, he needs everything to work in his favor, and that just simply isn't happening. So again, from point to point to point to point, we are starting to see the numbers move back in favor of Kamala Harris. Reputable forecasting sites, although 538 is standing even, you can find that The Economist now has Kamala Harris up. A week ago, they had her down. Nate Silver now today has it neck and neck. Before, he had it Donald Trump in the clear advantage for 2-3 consistent weeks. As we have gotten closer to this election, Kamala Harris has built herself back up. And that's why, again, I had Donald Trump as the victor less than 2 weeks ago. But today, Kamala Harris likely would win the election. It wouldn't be solid and it wouldn't be massive enough to say that we would feel secure in a prediction like that. But it is enough to say that if I was to call it today and someone said, put everything on it, who do you think wins? The answer right now, based on this last minute momentum, based on all of these different gains in groups and minimal losses, right? The whole thing here was about controlling the bleeding. We saw bleeding from 16 to 22. So I do want to say this too. Something that I probably should have mentioned in reference to 2020. When you're taking a look at the support amongst Latino voters across the nation, across the board, Kamala Harris is doing worse than Biden. Biden did worse than Hillary Clinton. So it was all about controlling the bleeding in states like this. I think that's where, we really need to understand is that it was never going to be a massive blowout. It was all about containing your losses and making gains in ways that you can really start to counteract it. And for a while, it very much seemed like that was going to be the case. And so even when you look at points of comparison, 2016, for instance, Hillary Clinton did phenomenally better than Biden amongst Latino voters in Florida. And yet, we saw the state only shift 2 points to the right. Why? Because Biden did better amongst white voters. If Kamala Harris can be running roughly on par with that of Biden in the last election, or even just where Hillary Clinton was, right? Or even, anywhere we're at, that's good news for the Harris campaign and boosts her odds in Pennsylvania because she's making it up somewhere else and she might not actually be bleeding as much as we otherwise thought. And so I think all across the board here, when we're looking at the final stretch of the campaign, the question has always been, who has the momentum? In 2020, it was clearly Biden, but he had maintained that momentum from April onward. At no point did Trump lead him nationally. At no point did Trump lead him in Pennsylvania. At no point did Trump lead him in Michigan. At no point did Trump lead him in Wisconsin. At no point did we see Joe Biden on track to lose the election. Did Donald Trump lead him in Georgia? Yes. Did Donald Trump lead him in Arizona? Yes. Did Donald Trump sway back and forth with him in these battleground states in Nevada? Absolutely. But Biden still came ahead. In 2016, though, everyone who watched the race and covered it can tell you, the momentum was on Donald Trump's side in the final stretch of the campaign. Hillary Clinton's lead collapsed after the James Comey letter from 5 points nationally to 1. Donald Trump surged across battleground states. She recovered slightly. She went up a point nationally, but in the battleground states, it just continued to tank. We saw that Trump was getting more positive press coverage. He was controlling his rhetoric. He was making everything seem as if he was much more presidential and on top of things compared to how Democrats had painted him throughout the election cycle. And it was that final home stretch that benefited the former president enough that he was able to win the election. Unfortunately for him, too many negative stories, too many negative numbers all around here. The signs are indicating that in the final 7 days, it is Kamala Harris who has won every single day. And the day before the election, it doesn't look like anything is going to change on the Trump side. And that ultimately, Kamala Harris now holds that upper hand right before the election. The question is it enough to overcome Donald Trump's lead that he had built over the past 3 weeks? Maybe, maybe not. Time will tell tomorrow when we start to see those election results pour in, and stay tuned for my final prediction tomorrow. And also make sure to check out the website, ltelections.com, the Discord server at discord.gg/LTE. Highly recommend it. And again, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.